Hey guys, welcome back to another Atlas Archives exploration, where tonight we're visiting perhaps the world's most geographically unique nation. Picture this, an entire country that exists as a donut hole inside another country, perched so high in the mountains that its lowest point would be considered a respectable peak almost anywhere else. This is Lesotho, the kingdom in the sky, where every single square metre sits above 1,000 metres of elevation, making it quite possibly the only nation on Earth where you literally cannot go downhill to sea level, because there simply isn't a way out that doesn't involve crossing into South Africa first. From the legendary mountain fortress that never fell to enemy armies, to a modern water empire that keeps the lights on in Johannesburg, this is a tale of survival against impossible odds, diplomatic brilliance, and a people who turn geographic isolation into their greatest strength. We'll discover how a minor chief with an unpronounceable name became one of Africa's greatest leaders, why this tiny kingdom survived when massive empires crumbled, and how selling water became more profitable than mining gold, though perhaps not quite as straightforward as it sounds. If you find yourself oddly invested in the fate of small mountain kingdoms by the end of this, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, we're just getting started with the world's most fascinating underdog stories. Now then, let's climb up to the clouds and explore the remarkable kingdom that geography forgot to give an exit. Chapter 1: The Kingdom in the Sky. Introduction and Physical Geography. Now, before you start wondering if this is some sort of floating nation held up by very determined hot air balloons, let me clarify. Lesotho is very much grounded on Earth, but it sits so high up in the mountains of southern Africa that its lowest point is higher than the highest peaks of many other countries. It's like the geographical equivalent of being that friend who insists on wearing platform shoes to already make themselves appear taller, except in this case, Mother Nature did all the work. Lesotho is what we call an enclave, which is a fancy way of saying it's completely surrounded by another country. In this case, that country is South Africa. Imagine, if you will, a donut. South Africa is the donut, and Lesotho is the hole in the middle, except this hole happens to be filled with some of the most dramatic mountain scenery you'll find anywhere on the African continent. About 2 million people who have made these heights their home for centuries, and probably the only place on Earth where you need to pack a winter coat for your African safari. The country covers approximately 30,435 square kilometres, making it roughly the size of Belgium, or if you prefer American comparisons, slightly smaller than Maryland but significantly more vertical. But unlike Belgium's famously flat terrain that makes it perfect for cycling tours, or Maryland's gentle coastal plains, virtually every square metre of Lesotho is mountainous. We're talking about a place where driving to the shops might involve navigating mountain passes that would make a seasoned alpine driver break into a cold sweat. Let's talk about elevation, because in Lesotho, altitude isn't just a number on a map, it's a way of life. The country's lowest point sits at 1,400 metres above sea level. To put that in perspective, that's higher than Ben Nevis, the tallest mountain in the United Kingdom, which tops out at 1,345 metres. This means that if you transported Ben Nevis to Lesotho, it would be considered a rather modest hill, possibly suitable for a leisurely afternoon stroll. Meanwhile, Lesotho's highest point, the Thaba, reaches 3,482 metres into the sky. The name translates roughly to beautiful little mountain, which is either an example of charming understatement or suggests that the Basotho people have a very different definition of little than the rest of us. the entire country exists in what most of the world would consider serious mountain territory. This extraordinary elevation creates some fascinating geographical phenomena and puts Lesotho in rather exclusive company. For starters, Lesotho is one of only 3 countries in the world where the entire territory lies above 1,000 meters in elevation. The other 2 are Andorra, nestled in the Pyrenees between France and Spain, and Rwanda, the land of 1,000 hills in East Africa. This makes Lesotho part of a very exclusive club of nations that could legitimately hold a high-altitude countries-only meeting without anyone feeling left out. The landscape of Lesotho is dominated by the Drakensberg Mountains, known locally as the Barrier of Spears, and frankly, whoever came up with that name clearly had a flair for the dramatic, because these mountains do indeed rise from the landscape like massive stone spears thrust upward by some geological giant. The Drakensberg forms the eastern border of the country and contains some of the most spectacular cliff faces and rock formations in all of Africa, including basalt cliffs that drop vertically for hundreds of meters. These mountains aren't just pretty to look at, though they certainly excel in that department. They're the source of several major river systems that flow not only through Lesotho but also into South Africa and beyond. The Orange River, one of southern Africa's most important waterways, has its source high in the Lesotho Mountains. It's rather fitting that a country called the Kingdom in the Sky should be the birthplace of rivers that flow down to nourish lands far below. The western part of Lesotho consists of rolling highlands and river valleys, creating a landscape that's slightly less vertical than the eastern mountains but still impressively elevated by global standards. This region, known as the foothills, is where most of the country's agriculture takes place, though calling it foothills is a bit like calling Mount Everest a rather tall hill. These so-called foothills still tower well above the surrounding South African lowlands. The central highlands create a landscape of rolling grasslands punctuated by rocky outcrops and river valleys. This region experiences some of the most dramatic weather patterns in the country, with summer thunderstorms that gather strength from the elevation before unleashing spectacular displays of lightning and thunder that echo across the mountains like nature's own sound system. Climate in Lesotho is largely determined by altitude, which creates a situation where the weather can be quite different from what you might expect in southern Africa. While much of Africa swelters in tropical heat, Lesotho enjoys what meteorologists classify as a temperate highland climate, the kind of weather that makes it entirely possible to need both sunscreen and a winter jacket in the same day, depending on the time and your elevation. The seasonal patterns follow the southern hemisphere calendar, with summer running from October to April and winter from May to September. This can be confusing for Northern Hemisphere visitors who arrive expecting warm December weather and instead find themselves in the middle of summer thunderstorm season, or who pack light clothing for a July visit, only to discover that July in Lesotho involves snow and freezing temperatures in the mountains. Summer in Lesotho brings most of the year's rainfall, often in the form of dramatic afternoon thunderstorms that roll across the mountains with impressive displays of lightning and thunder. These storms can be quite a spectacle, though they do have the unfortunate habit of making mountain roads even more challenging than they already are, turning simple journeys into adventures worthy of their own documentary films. The rainfall patterns are heavily influenced by elevation, with higher areas receiving significantly more precipitation than the lower valleys. This creates distinct microclimates within relatively small geographical areas, where you might experience completely different weather conditions just by travelling a few kilometres up or down the mountain slopes. Winter in Lesotho is when the kingdom truly lives up to its in-the-sky reputation. Snow blankets the higher elevations from June through August, creating scenes that would look perfectly at home in the Swiss Alps, If the Swiss Alps happen to be populated by people in colourful traditional blankets riding sturdy mountain ponies and speaking Basotho, the contrast between snow-covered peaks and traditional Basotho herdsmen is one of those sights that tends to surprise visitors who arrive with preconceived notions about what Africa should look like. The snowfall isn't just a light dusting that melts by midday. In the higher elevations, snow can accumulate to significant depths and persist for weeks at a time, creating winter conditions that rival those found in temperate mountain regions around the world. Some mountain passes become impassable during heavy snow periods, effectively cutting off remote communities until the weather clears. The country experiences significant temperature variations, not just between seasons but also between different elevations and times of day. In the mountains, temperatures can drop well below freezing during winter nights, while the lower lying areas might enjoy mild, pleasant weather during the same period. It's entirely possible to experience a 20-degree temperature difference just by driving from one valley to the next, which makes packing for a trip to Lesotho an interesting challenge. One of the most remarkable features of Lesotho's geography is the way water shapes the landscape. The country is crisscrossed by rivers and streams that have carved deep valleys and gorges through the mountain terrain over millions of years. These waterways create a network of dramatic canyons and river valleys that provide both spectacular scenery and practical routes through otherwise impenetrable mountain terrain. The Orange River system dominates the hydrology of the region, with numerous tributaries flowing through Lesotho before joining the main river on its journey to the Atlantic Ocean. The Caledon River forms much of the western border with South Africa, creating a natural boundary that has been recognised for centuries. The Tugela River begins its journey in the eastern mountains before flowing into South Africa and eventually reaching the Indian Ocean, making Lesotho one of the few countries that contributes water to both the Atlantic and Indian Ocean drainage systems. These rivers aren't just geographical features, they're lifelines that provide water for agriculture, hydroelectric power generation, and daily life in a country where every drop of water starts its journey at serious altitude. The Lesotho Highlands Water Project, one of Africa's largest infrastructure projects, harnesses the country's abundant water resources to supply both Lesotho's needs and those of water-thirsty South African cities. Lesotho's unique geography has created distinct ecological zones, each adapted to different elevations and climate conditions. The higher elevations support alpine grasslands that remain green and lush during the summer months, providing excellent grazing for livestock. These grasslands are home to unique plant species that have adapted to the harsh mountain conditions, including several varieties found nowhere else on Earth. The middle elevations feature a mix of grassland and scattered woodlands, with indigenous trees adapted to the high-altitude conditions. These woodlands provide important resources for local communities, including fuel, building materials, and traditional medicines, while also serving as habitat for various bird and animal species that have made the mountains their home. The lower valleys support more diverse vegetation, including some species typically associated with temperate rather than African climates. It's a botanical situation that keeps plant scientists thoroughly entertained and occasionally confused, rather like finding tropical orchids growing next to alpine flowers. The geological foundation of Lesotho is primarily composed of sedimentary rocks, particularly sandstone and basalt formations, laid down over millions of years. These rock formations create the dramatic cliff faces and flat-top mountains that characterize much of the landscape, giving the country its distinctive appearance of natural fortresses built by geological processes. The basalt formations are particularly impressive, forming distinctive table mountains with steep sides and flat tops that look as if they were designed by a geologist with a fondness for geometric precision. These basalt caps protect the underlying softer rocks from erosion, creating the dramatic cliff faces and steep-sided valleys that make Lesotho's landscape so visually striking. The road network in Lesotho is an adventure in itself. Building roads through mountain terrain that would challenge a mountain goat requires considerable engineering skill and probably a healthy sense of humour. The country's main roads wind through mountain passes and along river valleys, creating scenic routes that are undoubtedly beautiful, but can be rather nerve-wracking for visitors unaccustomed to driving at high altitude with significant drops on either side. Many communities in the more remote mountain areas are still accessible only by horseback or on foot, maintaining a connection to traditional transportation methods that have served the Basotho people for generations. The famous Basotho pony, a hardy breed adapted to mountain conditions, remains an important form of transportation in areas where modern vehicles fear to tread. This extraordinary geography has shaped not just the physical landscape of Lesotho, but also the culture, economy, and daily life of its people. Living at such high elevation, surrounded by dramatic mountain scenery, and dealing with the practical challenges of mountain life, has created a society uniquely adapted to its remarkable environment. The Basotho people have turned the challenges of mountain living into advantages, developing agricultural practices, architectural styles, and cultural traditions perfectly suited to their elevated homeland. As we prepare to delve deeper into the human history of this remarkable kingdom, it's worth remembering that geography is never just about rocks and rivers and elevation markers on maps. Geography shapes human destiny, influences cultural development, and determines the possibilities and limitations that societies face throughout their history. In the case of Lesotho, the dramatic mountain landscape has created a people and a culture as unique and remarkable as the kingdom in the sky they call home. Chapter 2. Before the Mountain Kingdom, Early History and Origins. To understand the story of modern Lesotho, we need to travel back thousands of years, long before there was any kingdom in the sky, when the dramatic mountain landscapes we explored earlier were home to entirely different peoples living completely different lives. The history of human habitation in what we now call Lesotho stretches back through countless generations, creating layers of cultural heritage as complex and stratified as the geological formations that define the country's remarkable terrain. The earliest inhabitants of the Lesotho region were the San people, also known by the somewhat outdated term Bushmen, though they prefer to be called by their traditional names like the various groups of San communities. These remarkable people were among the first humans to call southern Africa home, and their presence in the mountain regions dates back thousands of years. The San were hunter-gatherers who developed an intricate understanding of the mountain environment that would put most modern survival experts to shame. Archaeological evidence of San habitation in the Lesotho mountains is written not in books or stone tablets, but in rock art that covers cave walls and rocky overhangs throughout the region. This isn't your typical ancient graffiti, mind you. San rock art in the Maloti Drakensberg mountain range, which includes much of modern Lesotho, represents some of the finest and most sophisticated rock art in the world, with paintings created from about 3,000 years ago right into the 1800s. The San artists used natural pigments mixed with animal fat and plant juices to create remarkably detailed paintings of animals, humans, and spiritual scenes. They painted eland, the largest of the African antelopes, which held special spiritual significance in San culture. They depicted hunting scenes, ritual dances, and mysterious figures that scholars believe represent shamanic experiences and spiritual journeys. Some of these paintings are so detailed and artistically accomplished that they rival the cave art of Europe. though they continued to be created for thousands of years longer than their European counterparts. But the San weren't just talented artists who happened to live in caves. They were sophisticated hunter-gatherers who had developed an entire way of life perfectly adapted to the mountain environment. They knew which plants were edible and which were poisonous, where to find water during dry seasons, how to track animals across rocky terrain, and how to survive in temperatures that could drop below freezing in winter and soar in summer. They had developed an intimate knowledge of their environment that took generations to accumulate and was passed down through oral tradition, ritual, and yes, rock art. The San lived in small, mobile groups that moved seasonally through the mountains, following game migrations and the availability of plant foods. During winter, they might shelter in the lower valleys where the weather was milder, while summer would find them in the higher elevations where different plants became available and hunting opportunities changed. Their entire lifestyle was based on mobility, flexibility, and an incredibly detailed understanding of the natural world around them. One of the most fascinating aspects of San culture in the Lesotho region was their spiritual beliefs, which were deeply connected to their artistic traditions. The San believed in a creator figure called Kagan, sometimes represented as a praying mantis, and they had complex beliefs about spiritual transformation and communication with ancestors. Many of the rock paintings appear to depict trance dances and shamanic experiences, suggesting that these mountain caves weren't just shelters but sacred spaces where important spiritual activities took place. The rock art also provides evidence of how San life began to change as new peoples arrived in the region. Later paintings show images that clearly depict contact with people who owned cattle and sheep, wore different clothing, and used metal tools. These weren't paintings of imaginary beings or spiritual visions, but documentary evidence of the San people's encounters with new neighbors who would gradually transform the human landscape of the region. Around 1500 years ago, during what historians call the Bantu expansion, new groups of people began arriving in the region that would become Lesotho. These were Bantu-speaking peoples who brought with them revolutionary changes in technology and lifestyle. Unlike the San, who were hunter-gatherers, these new arrivals were farmers and herders who brought cattle, sheep, and goats, as well as knowledge of ironworking and pottery making. The Bantu expansion wasn't a single massive migration of people marching across Africa in organized columns, despite what the name might suggest. Instead, it was a gradual process that occurred over many centuries, with different groups moving into new areas, settling, intermarrying with local populations, and sometimes moving on again. Think of it less like an invasion and more like a very slow-motion version of people gradually moving to the suburbs, except it took place over thousands of years and involved an entire continent. The specific groups that settled in what would become Lesotho were part of the Sotho-speaking branch of the Bantu family. The most important early group were the Fokeng, whose arrival in the region can be traced through both oral traditions and archaeological evidence. According to tradition, the Fokeng crossed the Vaal River around 1500 CE and began settling in the Caledon Valley, which forms part of western Lesotho today. Archaeological evidence supports this timeline, as pottery found in the region shows distinctive characteristics that match early Fokeng cultural traditions. The pottery doesn't look particularly impressive to modern eyes, but to archaeologists, it's like reading a historical document written in clay. Different styles of pottery can tell us who made it, when they made it, and even something about their cultural practices and trade relationships. The arrival of the Bantu-speaking peoples, particularly the Fokeng and later the Quena clans, didn't mean the immediate disappearance of the San people. Instead, what happened was a gradual process of interaction, intermarriage and cultural exchange that created new hybrid communities. Some San groups adopted aspects of the new lifestyle, particularly cattle keeping, while maintaining elements of their traditional hunter-gatherer practices. Others maintained their traditional ways of life but established trading relationships with the new arrivals. This process of cultural mixing is evident in both the archaeological record and in later traditions. Many Basotho clans trace their ancestry to both Bantu-speaking founders and San people, and the cultural traditions of the region show evidence of this blending. Even the royal Quena clan, which would later produce Moshoeshoe and the kings of Lesotho, has traditions that acknowledge San ancestry and the incorporation of San people into their communities. One of the most significant changes brought by the Bantu-speaking peoples was the introduction of agriculture and animal husbandry. Instead of moving seasonally to follow wild resources, these communities established permanent settlements where they could grow crops and tend livestock. This represented a fundamental shift in how humans related to the landscape, from people who adapted to natural cycles to people who modified the environment to suit their needs. But farming in the Lesotho mountains wasn't exactly like farming in other parts of Africa. The high altitude, steep slopes and seasonal weather patterns required specific adaptations and techniques. The early Sotho-speaking communities developed terraced farming systems to prevent soil erosion on steep slopes, selected crop varieties that could tolerate the mountain climate, and developed seasonal patterns that worked with the region's unique weather. They also had to adapt their livestock keeping practices to the mountain environment. Cattle, sheep, and goats all had to be hardy enough to survive mountain winters and agile enough to navigate steep terrain. Over centuries, this led to the development of distinctive mountain-adapted breeds, including the famous Basotho pony, which would become an iconic symbol of mountain life in Lesotho. The iron-working skills brought by the Bantu-speaking peoples were particularly important in the mountain environment. Iron tools made it possible to clear land more effectively, cultivate difficult soils, and create better hunting weapons and agricultural implements. Archaeological evidence from the region includes iron slag and worked iron objects that testify to a sophisticated metallurgical tradition. Social organization among these early communities was based around extended families and clans, with leadership typically held by senior men who were recognized for their wisdom, wealth in livestock, and ability to mediate disputes. These weren't centralized kingdoms with vast territories, but rather localized communities that might recognize relationships with other groups while maintaining considerable independence. The concept of chieftainship that would later become so important in Basotho history began to develop during this period. Chiefs weren't necessarily hereditary rulers, but rather individuals who had gained respect and followers through their personal qualities and achievements. Wealth, measured largely in cattle, played an important role in establishing status, but so did generosity, wisdom, and the ability to provide leadership during difficult times. Traditional religion during this period was centered around ancestor worship and beliefs about the relationship between the living and the dead. Ancestors were believed to play an active role in the affairs of their descendants, providing protection and guidance, but also requiring proper respect and ritual attention. These beliefs would later interact in complex ways with Christianity when missionaries arrived in the region. By around 1400 CE, several distinct clan groups had established themselves in the region that would become Lesotho. The most important were the Phokeng, who had been among the earliest arrivals, and various branches of the Quena clan, who would later provide the leadership that unified the region. These groups shared linguistic and cultural similarities but maintained distinct identities and territorial areas. The traditional centre of Sotho-speaking peoples was believed to be a place called Tsatsi, located in what is now the Eastern Free State. According to oral traditions, this was where the first Sotho people emerged, and from where they dispersed to settle different areas of the region. While Ntsoanatsatsi has both mythical and historical significance, archaeological evidence suggests that the dispersal of Sotho-speaking groups was indeed a gradual process that occurred over several centuries. Life in these early communities followed seasonal patterns that were closely attuned to the mountain environment. Winter was a time for maintaining livestock in lower-lying areas, repairing tools and weapons, and engaging in craft activities like pottery making and metalworking. Spring brought planting season and the movement of livestock to higher pastures. Summer was the time for intensive agricultural work and also for hunting, as game animals were more active and accessible. Autumn brought harvest time and preparations for the coming winter. Trade relationships developed between different communities and with people living in other regions. Archaeological evidence includes goods that originated far from the Lesotho region, suggesting that even these mountain communities were part of wider trading networks. They traded surplus agricultural products, livestock, and iron goods for items like seashells from the coast, copper from other regions, and pottery styles that originated elsewhere. The early centuries of Bantu-speaking settlement in the region were generally peaceful, with communities expanding gradually into new areas and establishing themselves without major conflicts. This period of relative stability allowed for population growth, cultural development, and the establishment of the clan structures and traditions that would later become central to Basotho identity. However, this peaceful period would not last indefinitely. By the 18th century, population pressure, environmental changes, and political developments in other parts of southern Africa began to create tensions that would eventually lead to major upheavals. But before we get to that dramatic period of change and conflict, it's important to understand that the foundations of what would become the Basotho nation were laid during these earlier centuries of gradual settlement and cultural development. The story of early Lesotho is not one of empty mountains suddenly filled by arriving peoples, but rather of long processes of cultural interaction, adaptation, and development. The San people contributed their intimate knowledge of the mountain environment and their artistic and spiritual traditions. The Bantu-speaking peoples brought agricultural and metallurgical knowledge and new forms of social organization. Together, these influences created the cultural foundation upon which the later Basotho kingdom would be built. As we prepare to explore the dramatic events that would lead to the formation of the unified Basotho nation under Moshoeshoe, it's worth remembering that this remarkable leader didn't create something entirely new from nothing. Instead, he would build upon centuries of cultural development, clan relationships, and mountain-adapted lifestyles that had been evolving in the region for over a millennium. The kingdom in the sky had very earthly and very ancient roots. Chapter 3. The Great Chief and Colonial Pressures, Moshoeshoe I Era. As the 19th century dawned over the southern African highlands, the peaceful world we explored in our previous discussion was about to be shattered by events that would transform the entire region. Into this turbulent period stepped one of Africa's most remarkable leaders, a man who would take the ancient cultural foundations of the mountain peoples and forge them into something entirely new, a unified kingdom that could withstand the storms of the age. His name was Moshoeshoe, and his story is one of the most extraordinary tales of leadership, diplomacy, and survival in African history. Moshoeshoe was born around 1786 in a small village called Menkhoaneng, in what is now northern Lesotho. Originally named Lepoko, which rather ominously translates to dispute, he entered the world at a time when his community was facing accusations of witchcraft and internal tensions. His father, Mokachane, was a minor chief of the Bakoteli, a sub-clan of the Koena people. The Bakoteli numbered no more than 4,000 people, making them a relatively small group in a world where size often meant survival. To understand just how modest Moshoeshoe's origins were, imagine starting a tech company not in Silicon Valley, but in a small rural town where your biggest competition is the local hardware store. The Bacatelli were essentially the regional equivalent of a middle management position in the complex hierarchy of Soto clans. They were respectable enough, but hardly the obvious choice to produce the founder of a kingdom that would challenge both the mighty Zulu Empire and European colonial ambitions. Young Lepoko's transformation into the legendary Moshoeshoe began, as many great stories do, with initiation school. In 1804, when he was about 18 years old, he underwent the traditional circumcision and initiation ceremony that marked his passage to manhood. During this 6-month period of intensive education, he learned military tactics, traditional customs, and the art of praise poetry. More importantly, he formed bonds with his age mates that would later become the foundation of his political and military power. The event that transformed Letlama into Moshoeshoe involved what we might call history's most successful cattle raid with the best marketing campaign. Shortly after his initiation, the young chief led his band of age mates on a raid against a rival chief named Ramonaheng. The raid was spectacularly successful, and in the tradition of the time, Letlama composed a praise poem to commemorate his victory. In this poem, he declared that he had been like a razor which has shaved Ramonaheng's beard. The sound shoo, shoo, that a razor makes while shaving became his new name, Moshoeshoe the Shaver. By 1820, at the age of 34, Moshoeshoe had succeeded his father as chief of the Bacatelli and established his own settlement at Buthabuth Mountain. This timing coincided with the beginning of one of the most devastating periods in southern African history, the Mfecane, known to Soto speakers as the Diffakan or Lifakan. The Mfecane, which means the crushing or the scattering, was a period of widespread warfare and upheaval that lasted from approximately 1815 to 1840. While historians debate its exact causes, there's no denying that it fundamentally transformed the political and social landscape of southern Africa. The traditional explanation focuses on the rise of Shaka Zulu and the militarization of Nguni societies, though modern historians emphasize more complex causes including drought, population pressure, trade disruptions, and early European colonial impacts. Whatever its ultimate causes, the Mfecane created a domino effect of displacement and conflict that rippled across the region like a stone thrown into a still pond, except the ripples were armies of displaced people fighting for survival. Groups fleeing from conflicts in one area would attack and displace groups in another area, who would then be forced to move and attack others in turn. It was like a continental game of musical chairs, except when the music stopped, people died. The period was marked by the Mahlatule famine, named after the brown hyena, which was so severe that some communities were driven to cannibalism. Archaeological and oral historical evidence confirms that this was not metaphorical but tragically literal. Groups known as the Maratholi, whose very name meant cannibals, roamed the highlands preying on other survivors. Traditional social structures collapsed as people were forced to make unthinkable choices to survive. Into this nightmare stepped Moshoeshoe, and his response to the crisis would define not only his own legacy but the future of his people. Rather than simply trying to survive or joining the cycle of raiding and displacement, Moshoeshoe developed a radically different strategy based on diplomacy, integration, and what we might today call restorative justice. His approach was so revolutionary that it challenges many assumptions about African politics and leadership in the pre-colonial period. Moshoeshoe's first major challenge came in 1824, when his settlement at Buthabuth was attacked by the Tlokoa clan under Chief Sekonyela. Although Moshoeshoe's people successfully defended their mountain fortress, the attack exposed serious vulnerabilities in their position. Basotho, while defensible, was not impregnable, and Moshoeshoe realized that in the new world of intensified warfare, his people needed a better stronghold. The decision to move from Basotho would prove to be one of the most consequential real estate choices in African history. Moshoeshoe identified a sandstone plateau about 30 kilometers south, a flat-topped mountain that rose about 120 meters above the surrounding plains. The mountain had steep cliffs on all sides, natural springs, extensive grasslands on top, and only 6 narrow passes that could be easily defended. The move took place in July 1824, and according to tradition, they arrived at night. Moshoeshoe named their new home Thaba Bosiu, meaning mountain at night. Whether this name simply commemorated their nocturnal arrival or was part of psychological warfare is unclear, but Moshoeshoe certainly encouraged rumours that the mountain grew larger at night, making it impossible for enemies to attack. Given the superstitious nature of the times, this was probably more effective than modern military camouflage. Thaba Bosiu proved to be more than just a defensive position. It became the foundation of a new kind of African state. Rather than simply using it as a refuge for his own clan, Moshoeshoe transformed it into a sanctuary for all who sought protection from the chaos of the Mfecane. Refugees from dozens of different clans and ethnic groups found welcome on the mountain. Some were remnants of groups scattered by warfare, others were individuals who had lost their communities entirely, and some were even former cannibals seeking to return to normal society. Moshoeshoe's integration policy was revolutionary for its time. Instead of treating refugees as slaves or second-class subjects, he incorporated them into Basotho society as full citizens. He provided them with land, loaned them cattle to start new herds, and offered them protection and a chance to rebuild their lives. In return, he expected loyalty and military service when the kingdom was threatened. This policy rapidly increased his population and military strength, while creating genuine loyalty among his subjects. The first major test of Thaba Bosiu's defensive capabilities came in 1828, when the Amangwane, led by Chief Matiwane, launched a massive assault on the mountain fortress. Matiwane had established himself as the dominant power in the Caledon River Valley and saw Moshoeshoe's growing influence as a threat. The battle took place near the foot of the Kubulu Pass, the most accessible route to the mountain's summit. Moshoeshoe's tactical brilliance was on full display during this battle. Instead of simply manning the defences, he employed a strategy of concealment and surprise, holding back part of his age regiment and deploying them at the crucial moment when the enemy was fully committed to the assault. The Amangwane forces were completely routed, and Matiwane's threat was permanently ended. This victory established Thaba Bosiu's reputation as an impregnable fortress, and announced to the wider region that a new power had emerged in the mountains. The next major challenge came in 1831, when Mzilikazi's Ndebele forces, veterans of Shaka's military machine, launched a coordinated assault on Thaba Bosiu using 5 of the 6 available passes simultaneously. The Ndebele were among the most feared warriors in southern Africa, but the mountain's natural defences proved their worth as the Basotho defenders, fighting from prepared positions behind stone walls, repelled the assault with volleys of spears and showers of rocks rolled down from above. What happened next became one of the most famous diplomatic gestures in African history. As the defeated Ndebele forces retreated, Moshoeshoe sent a messenger after them with a gift of cattle, and the message that he believed hunger had compelled them to attack his people, but that there need be no lasting enmity between them. This extraordinary act of diplomacy not only prevented future attacks from Mzilikazi, but also enhanced Moshoeshoe's reputation as a leader who preferred peace to continued warfare. By the early 1830s, Moshoeshoe had transformed from a minor clan chief into Morena Ea Basotho, the great chief of the Basotho. His kingdom had grown to encompass not just the immediate area around Thaba Bosiu, but a vast territory stretching across much of what is now Lesotho and the Eastern Free State. More importantly, he had created a new kind of African political entity that combined traditional clan structures with innovative approaches to integration, diplomacy, and governance. Moshoeshoe also proved remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. When mounted Korana raiders armed with firearms began threatening his territory in the early 1830s, he quickly recognized that traditional military tactics would be insufficient against this new threat. Instead of simply trying to fight guns with spears, he began acquiring horses and firearms for his own forces while simultaneously seeking out new allies who could help him adapt to changing military technologies. The arrival of missionaries in 1833 represented both an opportunity and a challenge. The Paris Evangelical Missionary Society sent 3 French missionaries to establish a mission at Thaba Bosiu. Moshoeshoe's decision to welcome them was characteristically strategic. He had heard that missionaries could provide access to European technology, education, and diplomatic connections, all of which could strengthen his kingdom's position. The relationship between Moshoeshoe and the missionaries, particularly Eugene Cassilis, became one of the most important partnerships in southern African history. Cassilis served effectively as Moshoeshoe's foreign minister from 1837 to 1855, providing crucial knowledge about European politics and helping to navigate the increasingly complex world of colonial expansion. The missionaries also introduced new crops, livestock breeds and technologies while establishing schools and developing a written form of the Basotho language. Perhaps most importantly for the kingdom's long-term survival, the presence of French missionaries provided Moshoeshoe with connections to European powers that were not directly involved in southern African colonization. This gave him diplomatic options and sources of support that were not available to other African leaders who had to deal exclusively with British or Dutch colonial authorities. By the 1840s, Moshoeshoe had successfully navigated the worst period of the Mfecane and established the Basotho as one of the most powerful kingdoms in southern Africa. His success in unifying diverse groups, defending his territory against all challengers, and adapting to rapidly changing circumstances had created a state that was uniquely positioned to face the next great challenge, the arrival of large numbers of European settlers. The kingdom Moshoeshoe had built was unlike anything else in southern Africa. It was ethnically diverse but culturally unified, militarily powerful but diplomatically sophisticated, traditional in its social structures but innovative in its policies. Most importantly, it had created a sense of Basotho identity that transcended the clan loyalties that had previously defined political allegiances in the region. The scattered Sotho-speaking peoples of the mountains had become the Basotho nation, united under the leadership of a remarkable king who had turned the crisis of the Mfecane into an opportunity for political innovation and state building. As we prepare to explore the next phase of Moshoeshoe's reign, when his kingdom would face the challenges of European colonization and the pressure to surrender independence for protection, it's worth reflecting on what he had already accomplished. Starting from the leadership of a minor clan of 4,000 people, he had created a kingdom of hundreds of thousands. Beginning with a single mountain fortress, he had established control over vast territories. Most remarkably, he had transformed the greatest crisis in southern African history into the foundation for one of the region's most successful kingdoms. Chapter 4. Between a Rock and a Hard Place, Colonial Period. By the 1840s, Moshoeshoe had successfully navigated the chaos of the Mfecane and established the Basotho as one of southern Africa's most powerful kingdoms. His mountain fortress remained unconquered, his diplomatic reputation was legendary, and his people had grown from a few thousand refugees into a unified nation. But the very success of his kingdom would soon attract new challenges that would test his diplomatic skills more severely than any military threat he had yet faced. The arrival of Boer trekkers from the Cape Colony in the mid-1820s initially seemed like a blessing in disguise for Moshoeshoe. These Dutch-speaking farmers, fleeing British control during the Great Trek, created a useful buffer between the Basotho and marauding Korana raiders who had been troubling the region. The Boers possessed horses and firearms, technologies that Moshoeshoe was eager to acquire for his own people, and they seemed willing to trade. What began as a mutually beneficial relationship gradually transformed into one of the most complex and tragic land disputes in southern African history. The fundamental problem lay in completely different understandings of land ownership and usage rights. For Moshoeshoe and the Basotho, allowing the Boers to settle and graze their cattle was similar to offering hospitality to guests. The land remained Basotho territory, and the settlers were essentially tenants who could be asked to leave if circumstances changed. The Boers, coming from a European legal tradition that emphasized permanent land ownership, viewed their settlement very differently. Once they had occupied and improved land, built homes and established farms, they considered it theirs by right of conquest and labour. This fundamental misunderstanding was like two people signing a contract written in different languages, each thinking they were agreeing to completely different terms. The fertile Caledon River Valley became the flashpoint for this brewing conflict. This region represented some of the most productive agricultural land in the area, with rich soils, reliable water, and excellent grazing. For the Basotho, who had been using this valley for generations, it was essential for their agricultural economy and the survival of their cattle herds. For the incoming Boer farmers, it represented the promised land they had trekked hundreds of miles to claim. Initially, coexistence was possible because the region could support both communities. The Basotho and Boers even developed a profitable trading relationship, with grain and cattle being exchanged for firearms and gunpowder. Some Boers went so far as to consider themselves subjects of Moshoeshoe, acknowledging his authority over the region. But as more trekkers arrived and population pressures increased, competition for land and resources intensified. Moshoeshoe, ever the pragmatic diplomat, attempted to diffuse tensions through negotiation. In 1845, he signed a treaty that officially recognized Boer settlements in the area, hoping that formal agreements might prevent future conflicts. However, this treaty contained a fatal flaw. It failed to establish clear boundaries between Boer and Basotho territories. This omission was like drawing a map without border lines and expecting everyone to know exactly where they could and couldn't go. The situation became even more complicated when the British government decided to involve itself in regional affairs. In 1848, Sir Harry Smith, the Cape Colony governor, proclaimed British sovereignty over the territory between the Orange and Vaal rivers, creating what became known as the Orange River Sovereignty. Smith's plan was to bring order to the chaotic frontier by establishing clear boundaries and British administrative control over both African chieftaincies and Boer settlements. The British appointed Major Henry Warden as the resident magistrate, and he immediately set about trying to resolve the boundary disputes that were causing so much tension. In 1850, Warden drew up what became known as the Warden Line, a boundary that attempted to separate British territory from Basotho territory. The line ran from the Orange River through various geographical landmarks to the Caledon River, and it allocated the crucial Caledon River Valley to Moshoeshoe's kingdom. The Warden Line caused immediate outrage among Boer settlers, who felt that their established farms and communities were being arbitrarily handed over to African control. They had spent years developing these lands, building homes and establishing communities, only to be told that they were now living in someone else's territory. From their perspective, this was not just unfair but potentially catastrophic for their livelihoods and security. Moshoeshoe, while pleased to have official recognition of his territorial claims, was suspicious of British motives and concerned about the long-term implications of accepting British protection. He had observed British expansion elsewhere in southern Africa and understood that European protection often led to eventual annexation and loss of independence. However, he also recognized that his kingdom faced growing threats from multiple directions and might need powerful allies to survive. The tensions created by the Warden Line soon erupted into open conflict. In 1851, Warden assembled a diverse coalition of British troops, Griqua, Korana, Rolong, and a few Boers to attack Moshoeshoe's forces, ostensibly to enforce the boundary, but actually to reduce what Warden saw as growing Basotho power. The resulting Battle of Viervoet became one of Moshoeshoe's most decisive military victories, with his forces soundly defeating the British-led coalition. The victory at Viervoet demonstrated that the Basotho had successfully adapted to modern warfare, effectively combining traditional tactics with firearms and mounted cavalry. However, it also marked a turning point in British attitudes toward the region. The defeat was so embarrassing that both Governor Harry Smith and Major Warden lost their positions, and the British government began questioning whether maintaining the Orange River sovereignty was worth the cost. The following year brought another British attempt to assert control, led by General George Cathcart, who had been sent to restore British prestige after the Viervoet disaster. Cathcart demanded that Moshoeshoe pay a fine of cattle as punishment for the previous year's victory, and when the fine was not paid in full, he launched an attack on the Beria Plateau near Thaba Bosiu. Once again, the Basotho forces inflicted heavy casualties on the British troops. These military successes, while gratifying to Basotho pride, ultimately proved Pyrrhic victories. The cost of maintaining the Orange River sovereignty, combined with the embarrassment of repeated defeats by an African army, convinced the British government that the region was more trouble than it was worth. In 1854, Britain effectively abandoned the area by signing the Bloemfontein Convention, which granted independence to the Boer settlers and created the Orange Free State Republic. The establishment of the Orange Free State fundamentally changed the balance of power in the region. Unlike the distant British government, which had other global concerns and limited interest in southern African territorial disputes, the Orange Free State was a local power with very specific interests in acquiring Basotho land. The new republic immediately claimed all territory west of the Caledon River, including areas that Moshoeshoe considered core Basotho territory. What followed was a decade of escalating conflict that would test every aspect of Moshoeshoe's leadership and ultimately force him to make the most difficult decision of his reign. The Orange Free State, under presidents like Jacobus Boshoff and later Johannes Brand, pursued an aggressive expansionist policy aimed at acquiring the fertile lowlands that the Basotho controlled. The First Free State Basotho War began in 1858, when tensions over cattle raiding and boundary disputes finally erupted into open warfare. President Boshoff declared war on Moshoeshoe on March 19th, launching what the Boers called Senecal's War after the town where much of the fighting took place. The conflict followed the familiar pattern of Boer commandos attacking Basotho settlements and destroying crops and cattle, while Basotho forces retaliated with raids on Boer farms. Despite their superior firepower and mobility, the Boers discovered that conquering the Basotho would be far more difficult than they had anticipated. Thaba Bosiu remained impregnable, and the mountainous terrain of Lesotho favoured defensive warfare. The The Basotho had also acquired significant numbers of firearms through trade and had learned to use them effectively in combination with their traditional military tactics. After several months of inconclusive fighting, both sides agreed to a ceasefire, but the underlying territorial disputes remained unresolved. The Second Free State Basotho War, known in Lesotho as the Sekiti War, after the distinctive sound made by Boer cannons, began in 1865 and proved far more devastating than the first conflict. The Orange Free State, now under the more capable and determined leadership of President Johannes Brand, fielded a much larger and better equipped army that included significant artillery for the first time. The Sekiti War marked the beginning of the end for Basotho independence. The Orange Free State forces systematically occupied the lowland areas, destroying crops and seizing cattle on a massive scale, in a deliberate strategy to undermine the economic foundation of Moshoeshoe's kingdom. They made two determined attempts to storm Thaba Bosiu itself, during which the Boer military leader Lou Wepner was killed as he reached the summit of the Kubelu Pass, making him the only enemy ever to reach the top of Moshoeshoe's mountain fortress, though he paid for this achievement with his life. Faced with the systematic destruction of his kingdom's agricultural base and the imminent starvation of his people, Moshoeshoe was forced to accept the humiliating Treaty of Thaba Bosiu in April 1866. This agreement required him to surrender over 10,000 square kilometres of the most fertile Basotho territory, including virtually all of the productive agricultural land west of the Caledon River. The conquered territory, as it became known, represented the heart of the Basotho economy and the foundation of the kingdom's prosperity. But even this massive territorial concession failed to satisfy Orange Free State ambitions or resolve the fundamental tensions between the two powers. When disputes arose over the implementation of the treaty and accusations of continued cattle raiding, President Brand launched the Third Free State Basotho War in 1867. This final conflict brought the Orange Free State to the verge of total victory, with well-equipped Boer forces occupying almost all of Moshoeshoe's remaining territory. By early 1868, the once mighty kingdom was reduced to a single mountain stronghold. Only Thaba Bosiu remained unconquered, standing like a lonely island surrounded by enemy-occupied territory. The situation had become utterly desperate, with Basotho civilians crowded onto the mountain plateau while Orange Free State forces controlled all the agricultural land necessary for survival. It was at this moment of near-complete defeat that Moshoeshoe made the most difficult decision of his career. Recognizing that military resistance alone could not preserve the Basotho nation, he turned to British protection. On August 29, 1865, he had written to Sir Philip Wodehouse, "I am giving myself and my country up to Her Majesty's government under certain conditions which we may agree on." The process of securing British protection proved complex. Wodehouse was sympathetic and recognised the strategic value of preventing complete Orange Free State domination, but he needed authorisation from London. The British government, committed to reducing colonial expenses, was reluctant to take on new territorial commitments that might prove expensive. Moshoeshoe's growing desperation is evident in his correspondence. In July 1866 he wrote, "All those things I have given up into your hands last year. They are still yours. I still continue to be the humble servant of Her Majesty." The proud king, who had once sent gifts to defeated enemies, now found himself pleading for salvation from a foreign power. The British decision to intervene came almost too late. On March 12, 1868, with Orange Free State forces preparing for the final assault on Thaba Bosiu, Wodehouse finally received authorisation from London to declare Moshoeshoe's remaining territory a British protectorate, The proclamation forced the Orange Free State to halt its military operations, saving the Basotho from complete destruction at the 11th hour. The boundaries of the new protectorate of Basotholand were established by the Convention of Aliwal North in February 1869. This agreement confirmed British protection for the surviving Basotho territory, but also officially recognised Orange Free State sovereignty over all the conquered territories. The lost territory, thousands of square kilometres of the most productive agricultural land, remained permanently in Boer hands. Moshoeshoe died on March 11, 1870, just 2 years after achieving the British protection that saved his people. He was buried atop Thaba Bosiu, the mountain fortress that had never fallen to enemy assault, but whose defender had ultimately been forced to surrender his kingdom's independence to preserve his people's survival. March 11th remains a national holiday in modern Lesotho, commemorating the founder of the nation. The establishment of Basotholand as a British protectorate represented both salvation and tragedy for the Basotho people. Moshoeshoe's final diplomatic masterstroke had preserved the core of the Basotho nation and prevented their complete absorption into the Orange Free State, but it had come at the enormous cost of political independence and the permanent loss of their most productive agricultural lands. Chapter 5. The Kingdom Reborn, Independence and Modern Challenges. The British Protectorate of Basotholand finally achieved independence on October 4, 1966, emerging as the Kingdom of Lesotho under King Moshoeshoe II. Nearly a century after the first Moshoeshoe had sacrificed his kingdom's independence to save his people, his descendants reclaimed their sovereignty in a world transformed beyond recognition. The mountain fortress of Thaba Bosiu still stood unconquered, now overlooking a nation ready to write its own destiny once again. The road to independence had been surprisingly smooth compared to violent struggles that characterized decolonization elsewhere in Africa. The British government, facing the end of empire and rising colonial costs, had been generally supportive of Basotho self-governance. By the 1950s, the Basotholand National Council had gained significant authority over internal affairs, and political parties were forming to contest the territory's first democratic elections. The dominant political figure of the independence era was Chief Leabua Jonathan, a minor chief and great-grandson of the legendary King Moshoeshoe I. Jonathan founded the Basotholand National Party with backing from Canadian Catholic missionaries in 1959. In the crucial 1965 elections, Jonathan's BNP won 31 of 60 parliamentary seats, narrowly defeating the rival Basotholand Congress Party and positioning him to become the first Prime Minister of independent Lesotho. Jonathan's victory was something of an upset, achieved with support from traditional chiefs who feared that the more radical BCP would democratise the chieftainship system and undermine traditional authority. The BNP also benefited from Catholic Church support and, somewhat ironically, quiet assistance from the South African government, which preferred a conservative government in Lesotho to the Pan-Africanist BCP. Independence Day itself was marked by considerable ceremony and optimism. King Moshoeshoe II, educated in Britain and representing continuity with the founder of the Basotho nation, served as constitutional monarch, while executive power rested with Prime Minister Jonathan. The new constitution established a Westminster-style parliamentary democracy, and Lesotho immediately joined the United Nations, Commonwealth of Nations, and Organisation of African Unity. The early optimism of independence, however, quickly gave way to harsh realities of governing a landlocked mountain kingdom completely surrounded by apartheid South Africa. Lesotho's challenges were enormous. It was one of the world's poorest countries, with limited natural resources, minimal industrial development, and an economy almost entirely dependent on subsistence agriculture and migrant labour remittances from South African mines. The new nation's most fundamental challenge was what political scientists would later call the enclave problem, being completely surrounded by a hostile apartheid regime that controlled all access to the outside world. South Africa could strangle Lesotho's economy simply by closing border crossings or disrupting trade, making genuine independence more theoretical than practical. This geographical reality would dominate Lesotho's politics for decades. Prime Minister Jonathan initially pursued pragmatic cooperation with South Africa, despite the moral contradictions this created for an African nation opposing apartheid in principle while depending economically on the apartheid system. However, as the 1960s progressed, international pressure and domestic criticism increasingly pushed him toward a more anti-apartheid stance. The first major political crisis came just 4 years after independence, during the January 1970 elections. Early returns indicated that the opposition BCP, now led by Nutsu Mokhele and advocating a more confrontational stance towards South Africa, was winning a decisive victory with 36 seats to the BNP's 23. Faced with electoral defeat, Jonathan made a fateful decision that would haunt Lesotho politics for decades. On January 30th, 1970, Jonathan declared a national state of emergency, nullified the election results, suspended the constitution, and dissolved parliament. "I have seized power and I am not ashamed of it," he declared, claiming that the opposition was communist-influenced and posed a threat to national security. This autogolpe, or self-coup, transformed Lesotho from a promising young democracy into an authoritarian state. The aftermath was immediate and bloody. BCP supporters, convinced they had been robbed of legitimate victory, took to the streets in protest. Government forces responded with violent suppression, resulting in over 150 deaths in the riots and political violence that followed. King Moshoeshoe II was placed under house arrest, and many BCP leaders fled into exile. Jonathan's authoritarian rule fundamentally altered Lesotho's political character. He established an interim National Assembly dominated by BNP appointees, effectively ruling by decree while maintaining the facade of parliamentary government. Political parties remained legal in theory, but were severely restricted in practice, and opposition leaders faced harassment, imprisonment, or exile. Paradoxically, Jonathan's authoritarian drift coincided with a gradual shift toward more confrontational policies towards South Africa. By the mid-1970s, international pressure had pushed him to publicly condemn apartheid and provide limited support to South African liberation movements. He allowed the African National Congress to establish a presence in Lesotho, providing sanctuary for some anti-apartheid activists. This policy shift created a dangerous double bind for Jonathan's government. Supporting the ANC won him international credibility and domestic approval, but it inevitably provoked South African retaliation. The apartheid government possessed numerous ways to pressure Lesotho, cutting off trade, restricting border crossings, reducing employment opportunities for Basotho migrant workers, and supporting domestic opposition groups. South African pressure intensified throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s. The BCP, now operating from exile, formed the Lesotho Liberation Army with covert South African support, launching a guerrilla campaign aimed at destabilizing Jonathan's government. The irony was bitter. South Africa was simultaneously pressuring Jonathan to abandon support for the ANC while backing his domestic opponents. The LLA insurgency created a climate of fear throughout Lesotho during the early 1980s. Government ministers were assassinated, including Works Minister Jobo Rampeta in 1982, and bomb attacks targeted infrastructure in Maseru, Jonathan himself survived a car bombing in 1983, testament to the increasingly dangerous political environment his policies had created. The final crisis came in December 1985, when South African authorities claimed that Lesotho-based ANC operatives had killed 13 white South Africans in a bomb attack. Whether or not this accusation was accurate, it provided Pretoria with justification for decisive action. On January 1st, 1986, South Africa imposed a complete blockade of Lesotho, cutting off all trade and transportation links. The blockade was devastating and immediate in its effects. Lesotho, which imported virtually everything from South Africa, quickly ran short of fuel, food, and essential supplies. Within weeks, the country was down to just a few days' supply of gasoline despite strict rationing, and shortages of food and medicine were becoming critical. It was economic warfare designed to force political change, and it was remarkably effective. On January 20th, 1986, just 20 days after the blockade began, Major General Justin Metzing Lekanya led a military coup that overthrew Jonathan's government. The timing was hardly coincidental. South African pressure had created the conditions that made military intervention both necessary and inevitable. Jonathan was placed under house arrest, and Lekanya announced that all executive and legislative powers would be transferred to King Moshoeshoe II. The coup was greeted with celebration in the streets of Maseru, as crowds cheered the end of Jonathan's increasingly unpopular authoritarian rule. South Africa immediately lifted the blockade, and the first freight trains in 3 weeks rolled across the border, bringing desperately needed supplies. The apartheid government had successfully installed a more compliant regime, though this victory would prove temporary. The military government under Lekanya initially promised to restore traditional monarchy and eventually return to civilian rule. King Moshoeshoe II was given executive powers he had not possessed since independence, and political party activity was banned. The new government also expelled ANC members to Zambia, fulfilling South African demands for an end to Lesotho's support for the liberation movement. However, the alliance between military and monarchy proved unstable. Disagreements soon emerged over the pace of political reform and the extent of royal authority. By 1990, tensions came to a head when Lekanya stripped all powers from King Moshoeshoe II and forced him into exile in Britain, installing his son as Letsie III with only ceremonial powers. Lekanya's own position became increasingly precarious as domestic and international pressure for democratization intensified. The end of the Cold War had reduced tolerance for authoritarian governments, and neighbouring countries were pressuring Lesotho to restore constitutional rule. On April 30th, 1991, Colonel Elias Ramema led another military coup, deposing Lekanya and promising to accelerate the transition to democracy. After 3 years of preparation, Lesotho held its first free and fair elections in 23 years on March 27, 1993. The result was a stunning landslide victory for the BCP, which captured all 65 constituencies with over 70% of the vote. Ntsu Mokhele, the veteran opposition leader forced into exile after the 1970 coup, finally achieved political vindication by becoming Prime Minister. The 1993 elections marked a genuine watershed in Lesotho's political development. International observers declared the voting free and fair, and the military government honoured its commitment to transfer power to the elected civilian administration. King Moshoeshoe II returned from exile and was formally restored to the throne in January 1995. However, the return to democracy did not immediately solve Lesotho's fundamental problems. The country remained desperately poor, with limited economic opportunities beyond subsistence, agriculture and migrant labour. The decline of South Africa's gold mining industry created a massive jobs crisis that democratic government was powerless to address quickly. By the late 1990s, the number of Basotho mine workers had fallen from over 129,000 in the 1980s to fewer than 70,000, with devastating consequences for families and communities that had depended on mining wages for generations. One significant development that helped offset some economic challenges was the implementation of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, a massive infrastructure scheme involving the construction of major dams and tunnels to export water from Lesotho's mountains to South Africa's industrial centres. This project became the country's largest single source of foreign exchange, providing desperately needed government revenue while creating new forms of dependence on South Africa. The water project represented both opportunity and compromise for modern Lesotho. Water royalties helped fill budget gaps created by declining migrant worker remittances, contributing billions of maloti over decades. The project brought modern infrastructure to remote communities. However, entire communities were forced to relocate for dam construction, often receiving inadequate compensation, and the scheme deepened Lesotho's structural dependence on its powerful neighbour. Political instability continued to plague the young democracy despite the successful transition. Factional fighting within the army, disputed elections, and attempted coups remained recurring problems throughout the 1990s and beyond. In 1994, King Letsie III briefly ousted Prime Minister Mokele before being pressured by other southern African countries to restore him, demonstrating how fragile democratic institutions remained. The tragic death of King Moshoeshoe II in a car accident in January 1996 ended an era and brought his son back to the throne as Letsie III. The accident occurred under controversial circumstances that some suspected involved foul play, though no conclusive evidence was ever produced. The king's death removed a significant stabilising figure who had provided continuity with the independence generation. International intervention became increasingly common as Lesotho struggled with recurring crises. In 1998, South African forces intervened militarily under SADC auspices to restore order after post-election violence. These interventions highlighted both Lesotho's continuing instability and regional concerns about chaos. The fundamental problems that plagued the country since independence, extreme poverty, economic dependence, weak institutions, and political instability, proved resistant to democratic solutions. The transformation from labour reserve to water supplier created new opportunities but had not fundamentally altered Lesotho's dependent status. Despite ongoing challenges, Lesotho's story from independence to the present represents a mixture of achievement and disappointment. The restoration of democracy after decades of authoritarian rule was genuine progress, and the country has maintained its territorial integrity and cultural identity despite enormous pressures. The preservation of the Sesotho language, traditional customs, and monarchical institutions demonstrates remarkable cultural resilience. The kingdom has also shown adaptability in finding new economic strategies while maintaining sovereignty. Beyond the water project, Lesotho developed textile manufacturing for export markets and leveraged its unique position to maintain regional relevance. Participation in organisations like SADC provides influence over water resources, trade policies, and regional security matters. The kingdom that Moshoeshoe I founded in the 1820s, that survived the colonial period and that regained independence in 1966, remains very much alive in the 21st century. The challenges are enormous and ongoing: extreme poverty, economic dependence, weak institutions, and political instability. Yet the fundamental achievement of cultural and political survival that began with the first Moshoeshoe's diplomatic masterstroke continues to define the Basotho nation's remarkable journey through history. Chapter 6. The Mountain Kingdom Today, Contemporary Challenges and New Beginnings. The story of Lesotho in the 21st century is one of persistent struggle against seemingly insurmountable challenges, punctuated by moments of hope and determination that echo the resilience of the first Moshoeshoe. As the kingdom entered the new millennium, it faced a constellation of crises that would test every institution and social structure that had sustained the Basotho people through centuries of upheaval. Yet, like their ancestors who survived the Mfecane, colonial occupation, and the trials of independence, the modern Basotho continue to adapt and endure. The most devastating challenge of the early 21st century was the HIV/AIDS pandemic, which struck Lesotho with particular severity. By 2005, the kingdom had one of the highest HIV prevalence rates in the world, with nearly a quarter of adults infected. The pandemic decimated families and communities, claiming the lives of teachers, doctors, civil servants, and parents who were the backbone of Basotho society. Uniquely among southern African countries, more men than women in Lesotho were HIV positive, a tragic consequence of the migrant labour system that had sustained the economy for over a century. The mining compounds of South Africa, where Basotho men lived in single-sex hostels for months or years at a time, became vectors for disease transmission. Returning miners brought the virus home to their families and communities, creating a catastrophic cycle that undermined both the traditional family structure and the economic foundation of rural Lesotho. The irony was heartbreaking. The very system that had allowed Lesotho to survive economically was now threatening its demographic survival. Agricultural production, already declining due to soil erosion and climate pressures, collapsed further as the pandemic claimed farmers and disrupted knowledge transfer between generations. Food security became a persistent problem as traditional farming practices were forgotten and agricultural extension services were overwhelmed. The kingdom that had once fed itself from mountain agriculture now required regular food assistance from international donors. Climate change added another layer of complexity to Lesotho's challenges. The mountain kingdom's high altitude made it particularly vulnerable to changing weather patterns, with more frequent droughts followed by devastating floods. The carefully balanced agricultural system that had sustained mountain communities for centuries became increasingly unreliable as rainfall patterns shifted and extreme weather events became more common. Political instability continued to plague the kingdom throughout the early 2000s, with coalition governments rising and falling with depressing regularity. Between 2012 and 2022, no Prime Minister completed a full 5-year term in office. The pattern was always similar: electoral victories followed by coalition negotiations, brief periods of optimism, mounting tensions over corruption and resource allocation, and eventual collapse through votes of no confidence or military intervention. The COVID-19 pandemic, which reached Lesotho in March 2020, delivered what seemed like a knockout blow to an already fragile economy. The government imposed strict lockdowns to contain the virus, but these measures proved economically devastating for a population heavily dependent on informal trade and cross-border employment. Remittances from South Africa plummeted as mines closed and economic activity ground to a halt across the region. The pandemic response was hampered by institutional weaknesses and corruption that had plagued Lesotho for decades. The National COVID-19 Secretariat, established to coordinate the health response, became synonymous with mismanagement and the theft of funds meant to protect public health. Government officials who should have been leading the fight against the virus instead found themselves enriching themselves from emergency budgets, a betrayal that deepened public cynicism about political leadership. Yet even as these crises mounted, the 2022 general elections offered a remarkable demonstration of democratic resilience and the Basotho people's capacity for renewal. After decades of cycling through the same political parties and personalities, voters delivered a stunning verdict that reshaped the political landscape overnight. The election was dominated by a newcomer to politics, Sam Ntsokoane Matekane, a 64-year-old diamond mining magnate widely considered to be the richest person in Lesotho. Matekane had founded the Revolution for Prosperity Party just 6 months before the election, positioning himself as a political outsider who could bring business acumen to government and break the cycle of corruption and instability that had paralysed the kingdom. Matekane's backstory reads like a modern parable of Basotho determination and adaptability. Born in Manchoniane as the 7th of 14 siblings, he had started with nothing and built a business empire through diamond mining and construction contracts. His company, Matekane Group of Companies, had grown from modest beginnings in 1986 to become one of Lesotho's most successful enterprises. Now he promised to apply the same entrepreneurial energy to governing the kingdom. The Revolution for Prosperity campaign was unlike anything Lesotho had seen before, combining heavy social media presence with promises to make Lesotho great again, a slogan that deliberately echoed populist movements elsewhere, while tapping into deep frustrations with the political status quo. Matekane positioned himself as the messianic leader who would bring stability to Lesotho politics and end the corruption that had become endemic in government. The election results were emphatic, with voter turnout at a historically low 38%, itself a sign of widespread political disillusionment. The Revolution for Prosperity won 56 seats out of 120, just 5 short of an absolute majority. The traditional parties that had dominated Lesotho politics since the 1990s were routed, with the incumbent All Basotho Convention losing 40 seats compared to its 2017 performance. Matekane quickly assembled a coalition with the Alliance of Democrats and the Movement for Economic Change, giving him a comfortable parliamentary majority and a mandate for change. His cabinet appointments reflected his business-oriented approach. Just 15 ministers compared to 36 in the previous government, with an emphasis on cutting costs and improving efficiency. The new Prime Minister even financed his own inauguration because the government treasury lacked funds for the ceremony, a symbolic gesture that captured both the kingdom's financial crisis and his commitment to personal responsibility. The challenges facing Matekane's government were enormous. Over half of Lesotho's 2.2 million people lived in poverty, with youth unemployment reaching 37%. The economy had stagnated for years, shrinking by nearly 10% since 2016, while per capita income declined steadily. The public sector consumed 50% of GDP through one of the largest wage bills in the region, yet service delivery remained inadequate and corruption was widespread. Matekane's promise to tackle these problems within his first 100 days in office revealed both admirable ambition and perhaps dangerous overconfidence. He pledged to create 70,000 jobs within 3 weeks, a target that seemed more like campaign rhetoric than realistic policy planning. When criticised by activists for the lack of substance in his job creation plans, his government's response was troubling. The arrest of prominent unemployment activist Cholo Thakeli on charges of insulting the Prime Minister and inciting unrest. The Thakeli arrest sparked protests in Maseru and criticism from human rights groups across the region, forcing the government to quickly release the activist and step back from what appeared to be authoritarian overreach. The incident highlighted the tension between Matakan's businessmen's impatience with criticism and the democratic norms that Lesotho had struggled to establish and maintain. More concerning was the military's intervention during a vote of no confidence against Matakan in October 2023. When opposition parties attempted to remove the Prime Minister from office, security chiefs issued a joint statement pledging to interfere with any efforts to remove Matakane, language that opposition groups interpreted as a threat to launch a coup. Though Matakane ultimately survived the confidence vote by adding another party to his coalition, the military's involvement raised alarming questions about civilian control over security forces. These incidents demonstrated that despite the electoral mandate for change, Lesotho's fundamental problems, weak institutions, authoritarian tendencies, and the military's propensity to intervene in politics remain deeply embedded in the system. The pattern of initial optimism followed by mounting tensions and institutional breakdown that had characterized previous governments seemed to be reasserting itself even under new leadership. Yet there were also signs of genuine progress and adaptation. Matakane's government successfully renegotiated aspects of the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, ensuring that Phase 2 would provide more tangible benefits to local communities while maintaining the revenue streams that had become essential to government finance. The project remained controversial due to its environmental impact and the forced relocation of communities, but it represented Lesotho's most significant leverage in its relationship with South Africa. International partnerships offered new opportunities for economic diversification. The World Bank and other development partners launched initiatives to support youth employment, women's financial inclusion, and agricultural modernization. The kingdom's participation in preferential trade agreements continued to attract textile manufacturing, though these industries remained vulnerable to global economic shocks and changing trade policies. Perhaps most significantly, Lesotho was making progress in public health, particularly in combating HIV/AIDS. Decades of international support and gradually improving healthcare infrastructure had begun to turn the tide against the pandemic that had once threatened the kingdom's demographic survival. New infections were declining, and treatment programs were extending lives and reducing transmission rates. Educational initiatives were also showing promise, with technology-enhanced learning programs reducing dropout rates and improving teacher training. These efforts recognized that human capital development was essential for any sustainable economic transformation, particularly for a small landlocked country with limited natural resources beyond water and minerals. The resilience of Basotho culture remained perhaps the kingdom's greatest asset. The Sesotho language continued to flourish. Traditional music and crafts found new markets through cultural tourism, and the monarchy provided continuity and national identity, even as political institutions struggled. King Letsie III, while largely ceremonial, served as a unifying figure who embodied the connection between Moshoeshoe's original vision and contemporary aspirations. Looking toward the future, Lesotho faces the same fundamental challenge that has defined its history since Moshoeshoe's time: how to maintain sovereignty and cultural identity while adapting to forces beyond its control. The kingdom's complete enclosure within South Africa remains both a constraint and an opportunity, limiting independent action while providing access to markets, employment, and resources that would otherwise be unavailable. Climate change will likely intensify the challenges facing mountain communities, potentially making traditional agriculture even more difficult while increasing the frequency and severity of natural disasters. The kingdom will need to develop new forms of resilience while preserving the cultural practices and social structures that have sustained the Basotho people for generations. The digital revolution offers both opportunities and risks for a small African kingdom. Better connectivity could enable new forms of economic activity and service delivery, while also potentially undermining traditional authority structures and cultural practices. The challenge will be harnessing technology to serve Basotho interests, rather than being overwhelmed by it. Regional integration through organizations like SADC and SACU provides frameworks for collective action on shared challenges like climate change, migration, and economic development. Lesotho's strategic position as a water supplier gives it influence disproportionate to its size, though this leverage must be exercised carefully to avoid provoking more powerful neighbours. As this narrative draws to a close, Lesotho stands at another crossroads in its remarkable journey through history. The mountain kingdom that Moshoeshoe founded in the 1820s has survived colonial occupation, independence struggles, Cold War pressures, economic crises, pandemic diseases, and political instability. Each challenge has tested the resilience of Basotho institutions and identity, yet the essential elements have endured. The kingdom in the sky continues to adapt and evolve while preserving what matters most, the sense of national identity forged in the fires of the Mfekene, the cultural practices that connect contemporary Basotho to their ancestors, and the diplomatic tradition that has enabled survival against overwhelming odds. From Thaba Bosiu to the halls of international organizations, from traditional villages to modern cities, the spirit of Moshoeshoe's legacy lives on in the daily choices of ordinary people who refuse to surrender their identity to the forces of history. The challenges are enormous, the resources are limited, and the constraints are real. Yet the story of Lesotho is ultimately one of human resilience and the power of cultural identity to sustain a people through centuries of change. The mountain kingdom endures, and as long as the Basotho people retain their determination to remain themselves while adapting to new circumstances, it will continue to endure, a testament to the diplomatic genius of their founder and the unbreakable spirit of a mountain people who have never been conquered.